Hello everyone. In this series of videos, we will discuss William Wordsworth's essay, Preface to Lyrical Ballads. So let's start. Paragraph 1. The first volume of these poems has already been submitted to general perusal. It was published as an experiment, which I hope might be of some use to ascertain how far, by fitting to metrical arrangement a selection of the real language of men in a state of vivid sensation, that sort of pleasure and that quantity of pleasure might be imparted, which a poet may rationally endeavour to impart. Analysis. In this paragraph, Wordsworth explains the foundational idea behind the initial publication of the poems. He notes that the first volume has already been made available to the public. The collection was intended as an experiment. Wordsworth's goal was to see if poetry that closely mirrors the real language spoken by people experiencing intense emotions could effectively convey pleasure to readers. The phrase metrical arrangement refers to the structured form of poetry, like its rhythm and rhyme. Wordsworth suggests that using the actual language of everyday people, which he calls the real language of men, under vivid sensation, that is, strong feelings, poetry might successfully impart both a specific kind and amount of pleasure. This is what he believes poets should aim to achieve, creating pleasure through their work using a language that is accessible and emotionally resonant. This approach was somewhat revolutionary at the time, as it made a shift from the more ornate and artificial poetic diction that was common in earlier 18th century poetry. Wordsworth's emphasis on natural language was a core element of what would become known as Romantic movement in poetry. Paragraph 2. I had formed no very inaccurate estimate of the probable effect of those poems. I flattered myself that they who should be pleased with them would read them with more than common pleasure, and on the other hand, I was well aware that by those who should dislike them, they would be read with more than common dislike. The result has differed from my expectation in this only, that a greater number have been pleased than I ventured to hope I should please. In this paragraph, William Wordsworth reflects on his expectations for how the collection would be received by readers and the actual outcome of its publication. Wordsworth acknowledges that he had a fairly accurate prediction of the reactions the poems would provoke. He expected that those who appreciated the poems would find a deep, perhaps unusual pleasure in them, owing to their unique approach to language and subject matter. Conversely, he was also aware that those who did not like the style or content of the poems might have a stronger than average negative reaction. This polarizing effect was something he anticipated because the poems represented a significant departure from traditional poetic forms and themes. The phrase "flattered myself" indicates that Wordsworth had some hopes that the collection would resonate positively with at least some segment of the audience. His expectation was not just about how people would feel, but also about the intensity of their reactions, either strongly positive or strongly negative. However, Wordsworth notes that the actual outcome was somewhat surprising to him. More people ended up liking the poems than he initially thought would. This was a pleasant surprise, indicating that his experiment was more successful than he had dared to hope, suggesting that his innovative approach found a broader audience than anticipated. This feedback affirmed his poetic direction and encouraged further exploration of the themes and styles introduced in lyrical ballads. Paragraph 3. Several of my friends are anxious for the success of these poems from a belief that if the views with which they were composed were indeed realized, a class of poetry would be produced well adapted to interest mankind permanently and not unimportant in the quality and in the multiplicity of its moral relations, and on this account they have advised me to prefix a systematic defense of the theory upon which the poems were written. But I was unwilling to undertake the task, knowing that on this occasion the reader would look coldly upon my arguments, since I might be suspected of having been principally influenced by the selfish and foolish hope of reasoning him into an approbation of these particular poems. And I was still more unwilling to undertake the task, because adequately to display the opinions and fully to enforce the arguments would require a space wholly disproportionate to a preface. For to treat the subject with the clearness and coherence of which it is susceptible, it would be necessary to give a full account of the present state of the public taste in this country, and to determine how far this taste is healthy or depraved, which again could not be determined without pointing out in what manner language and the human mind act and react on each other, and without reacting to the revolutions not of literature alone but likewise of society itself. I have therefore altogether declined to enter regularly upon this defense, yet I am sensible that there would be something like impropriety in abruptly obtruding upon the public, without a few words of introduction, poems so materially different from those upon which general approbation is at present bestowed. In this passage, William Wordsworth discusses the concerns and advice of his friends regarding the success of his poems and the broader implications of the poetic philosophy underlying them. Wordsworth's friends believed that if the poems achieved the goals with which they were composed, they would establish a new class of poetry that could permanently captivate and benefit mankind. This new poetry, they felt, would be significant not only for its aesthetic qualities but also for its moral impact and its potential to enrich human experience. Due to their enthusiasm and belief in the transformative potential of these poems, they advised Wordsworth to write a systematic defense of the theory behind his poetic approach. However, Wordsworth expresses reluctance to provide such a defense for a couple of reasons. First, he fears that only theoretical argument he presents might be viewed with skepticism by readers, who could suspect him of trying to manipulate their opinion to gain approval for his work. He worries that his motives might be seen as selfish, undermining the credibility of his arguments. Second, Wordsworth is aware of the complexity of the subject. He believes that a proper defense of his poetic theory would require an extensive discussion that goes beyond the appropriate scope of a preface. Such a discussion would need to address the current state of public taste in poetry, assess whether this taste is healthy or corrupt, and explore the intricate relationship between language and human thought. Furthermore, it would involve examining the broader cultural and societal changes that influence literary forms and content. Ultimately, Wordsworth decides against providing a full-fledged theoretical defense in the preface. However, he acknowledges the need for some introduction to set the stage for his unconventional poems, given how different they are from the popular poetry of his time. This decision reflects his awareness of the transformative potential of his work and his desire to prepare readers for a new kind of poetic experience, even as he opts for a more modest introduction rather than an exhaustive theoretical exposition. Paragraph 4. It is supposed that the act of writing in verse, an author makes a formal engagement that he will gratify certain known habits of association, that he not only thus apprises the reader that certain classes of ideas and expressions will be found in his book, but that others will be carefully excluded. This exponent or symbol held forth by metrical language must in different eras of literature have excited very different expectations. For example, in the age of Catullus, Terence and Lucretius, and that of Satius and Claudian, and in our own country in the age of Shakespeare and Beaumont and Fletcher, and that of Donne and Cowley, or Dryden or Pope. I will not take upon me to determine the exact import of the promise which, by the act of writing in verse, an author in the present day makes to his reader, but it will undoubtedly appear to many persons that I have not fulfilled the terms of an engagement thus voluntarily contracted. They who have been accustomed to the gaudiness and inane phraseology of many modern writers, if they persist in reading this book to its conclusion, will no doubt frequently have to struggle with feelings of strangeness and awkwardness. They will look round for poetry and will be induced to inquire by what species of courtesy these attempts can be permitted to assume that title. I hope therefore the reader will not censure me for attempting to state what I have proposed to myself to perform, and also, as far as the limits of a preface will permit, to explain some of the chief reasons which have determined me in the choice of my purpose, that at least he may be spared any unpleasant feeling of disappointment, and that I myself may be protected from one of the most dishonorable accusations which can be brought against an author, namely that of an indolence which prevents him from endeavouring to ascertain what is his duty, or when his duty is ascertained, prevents him from performing it. In this passage, William Wordsworth discusses the expectations associated with writing poetry, particularly how it differs across time periods and what his contemporary audience might expect versus what he delivers in Lyrical Ballads. Wordsworth begins by discussing the general assumption that when an author writes in verse, they are making a commitment to fulfill certain established conventions of poetry. These conventions include using particular styles, forms, and types of language that readers have come to expect. He points out that what is expected from poetry has changed significantly over time, comparing different historical periods such as the time of Catullus, Terence, Lucretius, and later periods in English literature like those of Shakespeare and Pope. These shifts illustrate how the promise made by a poet writing in verse can vary widely depending on the literary context of their era. He then addresses potential criticisms of his own work. He anticipates that readers who are used to the ornate and elaborate style of many contemporary poets might find his poems unusual or lacking in what they traditionally consider poetic. These readers might feel disoriented or disappointed because Lyrical Ballads does not adhere to the gaudiness and inane phraseology that has become popular. Wordsworth uses phrases like struggle with feelings of strangeness and awkwardness to describe how these readers might react when they don't find the conventional markers of poetry they expect. Wordsworth hopes to preempt criticism and misunderstanding by explaining his intentions in the preface. He aims to clarify the purpose and rationale behind his poetic choices, thereby managing readers' expectations and defending himself against accusations of laziness or negligence. By doing so, he seeks to justify his departure from conventional poetic norms and articulate his commitment to a different set of principles, ones that prioritize natural expression and genuine emotion. Thus, Wordsworth not only seeks to defend his work but also to redefine what poetry can be, advocating for a shift in how poetry is understood and appreciated. He implies that fulfilling the duty of a poet might require challenging existing conventions and expectations to create work that is true to one's artistic vision and the realities of human experience. So this was the first part on the series on our ongoing discussion on Preface to Lyrical Ballads. We will meet in the next video and discuss the next part. Until then, goodbye and thank you.